Good day, my name is Gordon O'Brien, and today I'm going to present the Blended Learning Module number 4 to you in a series of 5 blended learning modules. The title of this blended learning module is Examples of Environmental Flow Assessments in Africa and an Introduction to the Application of the Method PROBFLO, which is a holistic environmental flow assessment method, and I'm going to present how this was applied in a case study in Africa. This blended learning module is produced as an outcome of the Nile Basin Initiative study titled Coarse Environmental Flow Assessments for Selected Sites in the Nile Basin. This is the fourth of 5 blended learning modules, and all of them have been presented in the context of the National Environment or the Environmental Flow Strategy for the Nile Basin. And what's important is to consider aspects of the fact that these modules address principles for good environmental flow aspects and environmental flow assessment methods. They consider transboundary management principles and practices, application of regional environmental flow assessments, and the implementation of the Nile Eflows framework. And finally, the last blended learning module will consider the context of sustainable development goals and integrated water resource management and environmental flows in the context of the Nile environmental flow framework. So please refer to the previous blended learning modules for more information. This blended learning module is going to focus on the application of PROBFLO in a case study in Africa. As already alluded, this is the fourth of 5 blended learning modules. Please consider the other topics. The first blended learning module is an introductory module. The second pertains to the environmental flow framework that was established for the Nile and its application. The third module presents environmental flow assessment methods and looks at some advantages and disadvantages of different methods. As I've said, this is the module on the application of the holistic environmental flow assessment method called PROBFLO. And then finally, we're going to look at the implementation of the framework in the context of regional and international development goals and integrated water resource management. This is the structure of each of the blending learning modules, and just to give an indication that we will go through these different components: an introduction, objectives of the module, contents, lessons, and finally I will provide some examples of additional reading that you can go to. For ease during the presentation, to make sure that we can demonstrate where we are in this structure, we will put this little icon key in the corner of each slide so that you can see where we are. Okay, we're going to move on to the application of PROBFLO as an environmental flow assessment method, and just some context behind it so that this blended learning module can be presented independently. What we've attempted to do with the development of PROBFLO and its application is to try and support the change in the view of how water resources are used by communities from being a resource that can simply just be extracted and diverted and allocated. In the context of sustainability, we know that this view of water resources is unsustainable. What we've tried to demonstrate and to use is this concept of environmental flows. And what we now know is that we are totally dependent on the environment around us, and we will present that in more detail in a moment. But what we're trying to understand is, in order for the availability of water as a resource to be sustainable, that is to ensure that we can continue to benefit from the goods and services associated with water resources in the future so that they don't change, we have introduced this context of environmental flows. And environmental flows, we'll talk about the definition in a moment, is considered to be that portion of the environment that the environment itself needs to sustain itself, to sustain its own critical processes, to maintain important species, and as a result, it has then the ability to be sustainable. Any use thereafter of that water resource must be considered in the context of the amount of water required by the resource. So in this graph, we've highlighted here the concept of the amount of water out of the total water available in a resource that the water resource itself needs. Now we do at this point understand that the volume and timing and duration of flows changes throughout the season, but we're just considering that if we can put all the water together, we would be able to understand and determine what is the amount of water required by the environment. And if we are using a very small portion of the utilizable water resource, the water resource that is available for allocation, but we're actually using a small portion of that, then it gives you an indication that the supply of resources greatly exceeds demand. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in many situations where the actual demand for water resources is so excessive that it's actually utilizing part of that water that is required by the environment to sustain itself. And in that case, you can see that the utilization of the resource is excessive, and this would be considered to be the situation where the demand for resources exceeds supply. What we're aiming for in this context of holistic environmental flow assessments is to try and determine how much water is available for the environment to maintain itself, and how much water can be allocated with a little bit of a buffer area to allow for that aspect of uncertainty to be considered. So this is somewhat of a precautionary approach where we allocate and allow for allocation of this utilizable portion of water, but we don't utilize all of it. We do allow this portion of buffer. And this is what we're targeting, and this is what we consider to be sustainable. Okay, moving on. So as I presented earlier, that we had this view of society had this view of water resources as something that we can just extract and divert and utilize. Now we realize that we're all part of this greater system, and in order for us all to achieve sustainability and to ensure that the world itself can be sustainable, we need to look at this better balance where we are a part of the environment, and the different attributes or the way that we're allocating and identifying those different parts of the system that depend on the resource, and how we can manage that resource in an equitable and sustainable way to ensure that it's available for future generations. So back to the consideration of environmental flows, and if you consider the total environmental flow, that's that portion of the water resource as I've explained earlier. If you could put that into a glass of water representing that portion of the water that the environment requires to maintain itself, you can consider what the different components of the water would be. So you can see here we've suggested that all the water that's available in a resource which is related to the mean annual runoff can fit into a glass, and that portion of water that can be allocated for use, that usable water resource, is that water that exceeds the environmental flows. As I said earlier, that this doesn't account for the timing and duration of flows. So the way we usually present these hydrographs is in this form, where we can see, and again, this is just you looking at the 50th percentiles over here and looking at the maximum flows. So in this graph, I've presented the 50th percentiles, the median of flows available in a particular environment on different months, January, February, March, April. And you can see that the amount of water changes throughout the year, that during August, September, October, November, this particular study area experiences this flood period, and then we can consider different attributes of the floods. And you can see that here I've demonstrated what the natural flows would be. It's this light blue graph with this light blue dotted line representing the median flows, and then the environmental flows, which is considered here in gray, representing the flood peaks, and this dark dotted line representing the median for the environmental flows. So this is how we are now representing that portion of the environment, or the water that the environment requires. And you can see that the way that it's provided to the environment, the way that the environment needs to receive it in order for the environment to be sustainable, is that at different times of the year it needs different amounts, and you can see that there definitely is variability in what would be the flood peaks and the floods versus the base flows. And that concept of maintaining the seasonal shape of the hydrograph is very important in environmental flow determinations. Okay, so the definition of environmental flows is that it describes the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows and levels, in particular that's important for wetlands, for example, necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems, which or that will in turn support human cultures, economies, livelihoods, and well-being. So the definition demonstrates that there's an intrinsic link between the benefit or the well-being of the environment and the provision of resources that people depend on. However, the determination of environmental flows is the definition requires for the determination of flows to maintain the ecosystem. Aquatic ecosystems in the context of the definition includes rivers, streams, springs, floodplains, and other wetlands, lakes, coastal water bodies such as estuaries or lagoons, estuaries, and groundwater dependent ecosystems, which at the moment is poorly understood and not very well integrated in environmental flows. But this is something that we're working on. Although we'll stick to the term environmental flows or Eflows, some prefer to use the term in-stream flow requirements, environmental water requirements, or environmental water, and they're all synonymous with environmental flows. This is the concept. This is why we are trying. This is our objective as society, to allow us to develop ecosystems or to develop resources. This is an example of time prior to the development of an ecosystem, and I'd just like to explain that in a particular environment, this is from the Rufiji environment in Kenya, this case study, where we understood what the natural uninterrupted hydrograph would have looked like. What we required was to establish this built infrastructure. We required to build a dam. And from the construction of the dam, we wanted to obtain hydropower and to utilize the dam for irrigation. We also had secondary benefits from the development of this dam in the form of reservoir fisheries, for example. If you consider the hydrograph prior to the development and the hydrograph post-development, you can see that although there are significant changes, the overall shape of the flow would be maintained. And the question here is, although we know that there would be some change in the ecosystem, in its structure and its function, we need to ensure that it is sustainable and that it does represent its biodiversity and those key ecosystem processes. So that's very important. And if you look at the benefits from this development, you can see in terms of the value of this development in the Fiji River, we've got some indication of the total value of the resources and how that was allocated to livestock, food, flood recession agriculture, floodplain fisheries, and marine fisheries or shrimp, the lower part of the study area, and the total value of the water resource. Post-development, you can see that the value of the resource increases significantly, and now we have this massive portion of electricity available to us. I wanted to highlight that the value of the livestock, for example, would decrease, but you would have these new benefits of power production, for example, and this formation of reservoir fisheries would be a new socioeconomic development as a result of the dam. So that's what we're trying to achieve when we look at environmental flow determinations. And the purpose of environmental flow determinations is to allow us to guide us in our developments, to ensure that we can develop, and there are opportunities to benefit from the development of the environment from a socioeconomic perspective, and also to ensure that the ecosystem is maintained in a viable condition. Moving on, here is a summary of the development of environmental flow practice in the world. And you can see that the development of environmental flows, the concepts and the methods and frameworks, for example, have been categorized into these 4 categories: emergence and synthesis phase, which extended into the mid-1990s, consolidation and expansion phase, globalization and new challenges, and then future environmental flow management. And this is where it's important that we're implementing and we're learning in an adaptive management context through the application of different environmental flow assessment methods. These 2 graphs, or lines on the graph, represent the amount of water resource development, and you can see that we've extended into this period where we're developing more than 50, up to 60% of our resources have already been developed, and that is widely published. And you can see in relation to that the number of publications and the importance of understanding how and what it is that we should be protecting and how to conserve it in relation to this development. And it's important that these 2 lines track each other, that we as we develop our resources, it's important that we continue to understand those resources and continue to develop and implement methods that can allow us to maintain the sustainability of those resources, because our very existence depends on the sustainability of the environment. What's really important here as well is to demonstrate how recently some of these environmental flow frameworks have been established that can allow us now to establish environmental flows on large regional scales. And that is something that has been presented in the previous blended learning modules that I advise you to go and have a look at. So the objective of this module is to present the foundations of PROBFLO as a regional scale ecological risk assessment based environmental flow determination method. Thereafter, the module will present a recent holistic application of PROBFLO for the socio-ecologically important case study in Africa, that is the Inner Niger Delta in West Africa. Finally, the module will present the outcomes of a PROBFLO case study and demonstrate some trade-off considerations for water resource management in Africa using PROBFLO. The contents of this module include another look at good environmental flow practices, introduction to holistic and regional scale environmental flow assessments, in particular PROBFLO, and then we'll look at the Inner Niger Delta case study. We will look primarily in the initially at the vision exercise, the conceptual model, which represents the risk pathways between sources, stressors, receptors, and endpoints related to the study, and how do I identify those attributes, and how do we evaluate the risk based on that causal model. We're going to look at the application of Bayesian networks as the foundation on which the modeling for the study was undertaken, including the determination of environmental flows. We're going to look at some scenarios and trade-off considerations. We're going to look at the outcomes of the PROBFLO assessment and its implementation in the context of adaptive management, and then I'll provide some additional reading. Back to good environmental flow practices. So it has been widely established recently that there are many aspects to consider when we're looking at principles of environmental flow. And in the application of PROBFLO on these holistic or regional scales, it is a holistic environmental flow assessment method. These principles in particular were instrumental in the development of the approach and how it is implemented. And they include consideration of integrated water resource management that advocates a balance between the protection and use of resources in an equitable manner on a regional scale. And that's really important, that now we're moving on to the concept of not just looking at these assessments on sites or reach scales, but looking at them on their own problem scale. And usually when we're looking at how developments of water resources have got upstream and downstream influences, we generally refer to the catchment as the appropriate scale of the assessment for a particular study. And then the consideration of environmental flows in the context of other synergistic anthropogenic, such as water quality and other drivers, such as climate change. That it's very important that environmental flows on these regional scale assessments truly consider the other determinants of the environment, these important environmental drivers such as climate change. Best practice environmental flow assessment methods must always include society in the decision-making process that promotes broad-scale buy-in and participation in water resource management. And that is vital, because at the end of the day, these resources belong to those stakeholders who live and use and manage those resources, and they need to be able to implement them. If these environmental flow assessment methods are not developed with them and for them, then they won't implement them, and we will not achieve that balance that is required through the application of these methods. We need to encourage awareness and education and the transfer of skills and or capacity development, especially for developing regions. And in Africa, this is a very pertinent issue, that we have a dire lack or limited amount of specialist resources available in the region of scientists who can contribute to these environmental flow assessments and also their implementation. Environmental flow methods must be evidence-based and present the uncertainty associated with the outcomes of those assessments explicitly. That's very important. We need to understand that context. Other important determinants such as climate change and human population growth, for example, should be integrated and considered, as I've mentioned. Environmental flow assessment methods that consider multiple stresses, define the relationship between stresses and multiple social and ecological endpoints are important, and can allow for the evaluation of the trade-offs between these socio-ecological endpoints, which is preferable. So in this context, we want to understand what the environment needs as a control and what is the best way to utilize our resources from a socio-economic and ecological context. And finally, best practice includes those environmental flow assessments that can be monitored, or those assessments that can be monitored and tested by local expertise. Case studies should be subjected to scientific peer review process to promote objectivity and continue to develop scientific best practices. That's what we consider to be best scientific practice, is that work and outcomes that are presented in peer-reviewed journals. We need to adopt the precautionary approach in an adaptive management context, and that is important where we're looking at allocation of flows and the context of the certainty associated with these environmental flow assessment methods. We need to look at mitigation measures to avoid or reduce the likelihood of negative impacts associated with these developments. And finally, environmental flow methods or management should not be considered to be a flawless, but a continually developing science. Okay, and in the context of the development of the environmental flow framework for the Nile Basin, these best flow practices were summarized into these 7 pillars for the environmental flow framework, where we consider the importance of collaboration, working together, sharing the benefits of the resources with the stakeholders and those communities who are affected by development directly, ensuring sustainability and managing towards sustainability. These assessments should be evidence-based, and we should adopt the principle of requisite simplicity, which is to do and manage as much as is necessary to achieve these sustainable balances. We need to ensure transparency and encourage the sharing of information, the sharing of ideas, the sharing of expertise, and the sharing of evidence in particular related to the outcomes of these assessments, so that they can be incorporated into other assessments. And finally, we need to consider all of these assess or these evaluations in an adaptability context that we should be learning while doing. We should not wait to implement environmental flows because we don't know exactly what the environmental flow requirement would be, or there is some uncertainty associated with the assessment. We need to adopt the precautionary approach and to learn while we already try to implement some of these practices. And these principles resulted in the formation of this environmental flow framework and the 7 procedural steps of the environmental flow framework, which is presented in the blended learning module number 2. And the idea of this is to ultimately in the future be able to manage and integrate the environmental flow management of water resources in the Nile Basin on a basin scale. Importantly, this little icon has been highlighted here, and that's just to remind us that in many cases these methods that we develop and the frameworks we develop do not achieve the outcomes that we have initially hoped for or highlighted, and that's often because these tools are not used for what they were designed to do. And from an environmental flow assessment method context, it's very important that there are benefits, cost-benefit implications associated with different methods, but that the different methods should be implemented and used the way that they were designed, and they should be used to do what they were designed to do. And that's just an important consideration that we should consider when we're looking at these holistic environmental flow assessment methods. Then if we have a look at the different types of methods, so what are these methods? They are tools. Environmental flow assessment methods are tools, and those are tools used to characterize the original flow regime of a river, which is needed to maintain a specific or specified and valued feature of that environment. So in other words, the tools are designed to identify and to provide information on the requirements of the ecosystem to maintain a certain structure and function and or attributes of their system to maintain it in a particular ecological state or a social state, for example. And we'll unpack that as we move along with the demonstration. Features of those systems should consider or include ecological, social, and economic endpoints. Those are all the things that we care about from a development and a protection perspective from our environments. Environmental flow assessment methods established for rivers and associated floodplains and estuaries and associated ecosystems are available for us to utilize. And again, we should use them for what they were designed to do. This is a very simple table which is unpacked in blended learning module number 3, which considers the differences in environmental flow assessment methods. And this is again just to demonstrate that there are different hydrological, hydraulic rating, habitat simulation, and holistic environmental flow assessment methods. And all of them can be undertaken either on a rapid or reconnaissance level implementation and or with data, and in order to provide high confident outputs, they can be undertaken on a comprehensive level of assessment or implementation, and that often requires habitat or site assessments. Holistic methods, by the way, that consider regional scale assessments are there and designed to upgrade from a site, information available on sites, to make it applicable to consider processes that are occurring on reaches, sub-basins, looking at downstream and upstream drivers of change and integration, as well as in attempt to synchronize the availability of flows, for example, and the consequence of altered flows. And that would then be relevant on a river basin scale. We would then look on a Nile sub-basin scale, and that would then allow us to start to look at the environmental flow management on a basin scale. So these holistic regional scale methods are designed to allow us to upscale from site assessments all the way towards the ability to manage environmental flows for the whole basin, and that was the purpose for the development of the Nile environmental flow framework. These are a different, this is a simple table of the cost benefit of the different categories of environmental flow assessment methods, considering hydrological methods, hydraulic rating methods, habitat-based methods, and holistic methods. And you can see that the amount of time required to carry out these methods increases as the complexity of the method increases. The desktop, intermediate, and comprehensive application of the method increases as you move towards holistic methods. The data requirements, it makes sense that with a lot more confidence, you need a lot more information, and then information pertains to hydrological data, hydraulic data, habitat data, water quality data, water resource use scenarios, ecological data, and we often use fish, invertebrates, riparian vegetation. You can use mammals, you can look at migratory birds, you can look at amphibians, for examples, and other reptiles. We need social information, economic data, and that's progressing towards these truly holistic methods. From a human resource requirement perspective, looking at the specialists that are required for these assessments, you need environmental flow specialists, hydrologists, engineers, these hydraulic engineers in particular, which is often one of the major limitations of a lot of these assessments to allow us to progress from hydraulic rating, habitat-based assessments, and holistic methods. Also ecologists, social scientists, and economists. Finally, if you consider the financial requirements, you can see that it increases from thousands of US dollars into millions of US dollars. Transparency opportunities increase, although there have been some issues with dynamic methods and the so-called black box issue with trying to obtain that information and trying to understand the process of those different assessments. The flexibility of the approaches, considerations, uncertainty presented, it should increase as you go on, but you can see there are these issues with the more dynamic, more complicated assessment methods. Confidence goes way up, and then the adaptability as well is something that we need to consider with the different applications. Now we're going to move on to PROBFLO, and just as an introduction, we'd just like to present that PROBFLO is based on regional scale ecological risk assessment foundations. And what that is regional scale ecological risk assessments originated themselves from traditional environmental or ecological risk assessment methods where stresses were evaluated and considered how different types of toxicants or stimuli or any type of stress in the environment would affect a particular type of receptor, and we know that we would obtain a response from that combination, and that would then demonstrate the risk of that particular stressor to the receptor. That was upscaled in 1997, where on a regional scale, the locations of multiple stresses, the locations of multiple receptors that occur in many different habitats, as well as the locations of multiple receptors that can be packaged into ecological impacts, needed to be considered. And what was important then was to consider the location of these different attributes or features on the environment, and that would influence the probable risk pathways, whether there is an opportunity for exposure and ecological effects of these different stresses in the environment based on where they occur in the environment, and how in a resource, for example, they can flow or move from one area to another area. So that was the foundation of the development of the regional scale risk assessment framework, which is an upscaling from the traditional environmental flow assessment. And I'd like at this point just to highlight some publications that have embraced this application. Importantly, Professor Wayne Landis from North America has done a lot of work in the space, and with Wayne Landis and Wiegers actually established the method in 1997. But this ecological risk in the context of global climate change was a very useful paper to consider the application. I'd also like to direct you towards work that has been done in Africa in 2012 on the regional scale risk assessment method using the relative risk model in South Africa, and then the recent publication on a regional scale risk assessment framework for environmental flow evaluations, which is the PROBFLO paper itself, and that is available for free online. Okay, and this takes us right back to the method and how the method was developed with its own 10 procedural steps that I've highlighted here on the left, and how we're trying to move away from our utilization and the view of resources as something that we can just extract and divert and change, to how do we represent that system and human beings and the socioeconomic requirements of different African communities in the context of these dynamic ecosystems that vary so much in time and space. And this is an example from the case study that we're presenting here of the Niger River, where we know that we have these timing, durations, and volumes of flows, and that then in the environment influences so many ecological and social attributes of the ecosystem that is important for us to consider, especially when we're trying to establish environmental flows for the study area. So this is a simple diagram to demonstrate how habitat, water quality, biodiversity, ecological processes, food web processes, migrations of birds and migrations of fish, and waterborne diseases and the extraction of resources for the maintenance of livelihoods, for example, is all integrated, and different attributes of this larger socio-ecological system that we need to represent in our assessments. And what's very important in order to understand what attributes of this dynamic socio-ecological system we need to represent is we need to identify these endpoints. And these endpoints in a PROBFLO assessment is what represents what we care about in the environment and where they occur. And this is such an important component that I'd like to just stop here for a moment and unpack that, because it is the endpoints and the vision associated with the endpoints that allows us to that will allow the outcomes of an environmental flow assessment to be integrated into national water resource management and associated objectives. And in this case, for example, I've just suggested that they can contribute to the obtaining and meeting resource quality objectives. And then on an international scale, where we consider sustainable development goals and whether or not we are achieving the sustainable balance between the use and protection of environments. This is what opportunity is available for us, but it is critical that we choose the right endpoints. And those endpoints then represent what it is in that environment that we care about and where they exist. Now, it's very difficult in some case studies because we don't have a lot of information on what is the sustainable balance between the use and protection of different attributes of the resource. That is what we would, for example, establish during a resource quality objective or the target setting process of Sustainable Development Goals, for example. And what we often find ourselves doing, and this is what was the case study in the Niger Delta, is that in the absence of this information, stakeholders and the different regulators of the water resources required us to maintain the ecosystem in a particular condition that represented their acceptable balance between the use and the protection of the environment. So in that context, it can be simplified. And in this case study, we did have information and we were unable to unpack the vision and IWRM outputs of this particular case study that represented that suitable state, that balance between the use and protection of the resource that we needed to set environmental flows for. And for this case study, we selected a range of social and ecological endpoints that would then represent different attributes of that socio-ecological system and the state of those attributes that we could then use in our assessment. And for example, we had opportunities to develop three social endpoints. They included maintain the production potential of indigenous vegetation and subsistence agriculture to sustain community livelihoods. That included, very importantly, the recession agriculture that was very important in the Inner Niger Delta floodplain. Secondly, we wanted to maintain fisheries production for the community livelihoods, and we had some indication of the size of the fisheries and the size of the community that needed to be maintained. So they're very explicit endpoints. We then needed to manage water disease to ensure that there was no increase in the risk of waterborne diseases to local communities. And that was a first tier. Ideally, we would like to eradicate all waterborne diseases, but in the context of this sustainable balance between use, protection, and the degradation of the environment, we at least did not, in the context of selecting endpoints, would not allow any waterborne diseases to increase. Then we consider a range of ecological endpoints for this ecologically sensitive ecosystem, including the vast Inner Niger Delta. And here we considered maintaining habitats and ecosystem processes for indicator floodplain macrophytes, that's a vegetation, that's aquatic vegetation and riparian vegetation, and that includes specific specialist plants that represent the different habitat characteristics in the Inner Niger Delta. Secondly, we were interested in riverine or riparian vegetation from the rivers, and that would include the maintenance of habitats and ecosystem processes for indicator riparian vegetation and those base flows in the Niger and Barney rivers. So some of the endpoints were only applicable in the Inner Niger Delta, for example, the ecological endpoint 1, which is floodplain vegetation, compared to the riverine vegetation, which was applicable in the riverine part of the catchment. We considered invertebrates for the river, where we required to maintain habitats and processes associated with indicator invertebrates, and to maintain the diversity and the community structures of invertebrates in the rivers. And what was very important there is these fast flow specialist species called rheophilic species. Very similar for floodplain indicator invertebrates and the identification of species that are called limnophiles, that are specialist species for that flooded wetland type environment. Similar for fish, for riverine fish and floodplain indicator fish species. And then we included aquatic mammals, and that was importantly based on the existence of the rare and protected manatee that occur within the Inner Niger Delta floodplain. Ecological endpoint 8 then included maintaining habitats and ecosystem processes for indicator resident birds from the Niger and Barney rivers, as well as the resident birds from the Inner Niger Delta, and then finally to consider migratory birds that utilize the Inner Niger Delta as a stopover point, or birds that would migrate to the delta and during the summers and then migrate back into different parts of the world. And that would be very important that the system maintains that larger scale ecosystem process that influences huge different parts of the world. Okay, again, consider that these are the endpoints that were selected that represent these targets or objectives that would give us, if we maintain this, it was established by the different stakeholders of the study that if we could provide the volume, timing, duration, and frequency of flows, and in the consideration of other synergistic drivers, we would be able to achieve that sustainable balance between the use and protection of these resources, and that would then ultimately contribute towards the maintenance of this global effort to achieve sustainable development goals. Back to our concept of the integrated socio-ecological systems. In these environmental flow assessment studies, we often have a difficulty when we consider the different attributes of the system in the context of comparing apples and pears, that what scale can you base and represent these different attributes on, and we refer to in a regional scaled ecological risk assessment context to the requirement of establishing a ranking scheme where you can convert the attributes, identify the attributes of the ecosystem, whether they be ecological attributes or social attributes, and represent the state of that attribute in a zero, low, medium, or high potential state in the context of risk. So this would be that there would be no risk to that endpoint, high risk to that particular attribute or endpoint, and that would often relate to an ecosystem being in a critically modified condition. And the point of just putting this graph here is to show you that there is some overlap between these classification systems that are used, where, for example, we can classify ecosystems from an A to an F ecological state, referring to pristine to critically modified. And generally, you would be able to relate that these ecosystems that are in a critically modified state, there would probably be a very high potential of risk to the maintenance of those socio-ecological endpoints that we care about. Often you can also consider it to be unsuitable or suitable with an important sustainability threshold, and or we can consider these unsustainable, sustainable, and natural conditions. So these are the ranking schemes, and in this environmental flow assessment method, we use this zero, low, medium, high ranking scheme to represent ecosystems or attributes of those ecosystems that are in a pristine state, in an largely acceptable state, in a medium. This medium category was there to represent this threshold of sustainability, and then high would represent this unsuitable, unsustainable ecological state. And for these assessments, we need a range of scientists usually who can contribute to these assessments, and that was available to us in this case study, where we had social scientists, hydraulic engineers, geomorphologists, chemists, hydrologists, ecologists, and risk assessment scientists, all working together to implement PROBFLO. This is the study area. So this was the environmental flow determination study for the upper Niger River Basin and the inner Niger Delta. And you can see it includes the larger Barney River and the Niger River, and then the inner Niger Delta in West Africa. Okay, these a little more focused, and you can see that what we did was we divided the study area into these 8. You can see there's a small one over there, but these the different risk regions that represent the upper riverine portion of the study area, and in this green color, the inner Niger Delta itself. Okay, the next step was to establish these conceptual models that represent our understanding of the different drivers that influence the environment, the nature of the stresses themselves, the habitats and the different receptors that we would find in these habitats and their selection, and ultimately how they would be affecting these socio-ecological endpoints that we selected for the study area. And in this case, for example, I'd just like to highlight the fisheries endpoint. Is once we have these master conceptual models, we would unpack them, and this would guide us and give us information throughout the study area, looking at different risk regions as we progress down the catchment, what the potential relationship would be for there to be risk associated with these climate change, agriculture, dam, human community developments, infrastructure developments, and industries, and how those would translate into water quantity, flow, habitat modification, and population pressure stresses, and determinants of the socio-ecological system that this system would be responding to on a holistic scale. So although we need an understanding of what is driving the system, we could then unpack it and build these models, these socio-ecological models that represent different parts of the system for each of these different risk regions. Just to give you an example, so in this case study, from our unpacking of this initial conceptual model, we, in the context of this one endpoint maintaining fisheries, we were able to represent this part of the socio-ecological system for the inner Niger Delta as an example, by considering that in order to maintain the subsistence fishery of the delta, we would first need to be able to represent the potential for subsistence fishermen to occur within the delta and what their dependence on the resource would be, and whether or not the environment was in a suitable condition. So the last component of the environment would be the suitability of the environment that would represent the supply of the resource. So, or the potential would represent the demand of fisheries, the environmental suitability would represent the supply of fisheries, and that would allow us then to describe the potential risk to the subsistence fishery. And if you unpack the environmental suitability, it would be a function of the productivity of the environment, human pressure, and floodplain suitability. And if you unpack that again, productivity was deemed to be based on sediment supply and land use activities, land use erosion. Floodplain suitability was considered to be a function of connectivity depth for migrations to occur, migration queues to allow species to occur, and floodplain habitat, which was very important. And floodplain habitat in the context of maintaining these subsistence fisheries was based on the river quality, mudflats, and the availability of food for these species. And that was often why many species were migrating into the study area, as well as cover that would allow the habitat to be suitable to maintain species. If the habitat was suitable to maintain these preferred subsistence fisheries species, then the probable risk of the habitat being a major driver of change would be low. If the floodplain was suitable in terms of access for species to enter the floodplain, again, the potential risk would be low. And if the environmental suitability was high, then the potential risk would be low in the context of maintaining or meeting that subsistence fisheries. This is one simple example of how that conceptual model is unpacked and repackaged into a Bayesian network model that represents that attribute of the environment. And in this case study, what we did was we collected a lot of biological and ecological data for the different species. We had information on migrations and migration timing. We had information on the habitat preferences or requirements. We had information on the feeding biology, and importantly for the delta, in terms of different groups of species, we had good indications of the different floods and when different species would enter and or utilize different attributes of the inner Niger Delta for food, for spawning habitats, for recruitment habitats, for example. And with that information, we were able then to not only set up these Bayesian networks or these and the models that represent that part of that social and ecological system, but to actually input the data that represents all the different attributes that were considered. So we did this for the inner Niger Delta, and we unpacked the data because of the flow focus of the study. Where possible, we selected indicators that were related to flow. So where we, for example, we're looking at suitable habitat characteristics, we would look at the discharge required to provide a certain depth and velocity of a particular habitat associated with knowledge or evidence of species that required that particular flow, velocity, and habitat characteristic in terms of its depth, for example, in different parts of the study area. So based on that, what we wanted to do was also ensure that these models accounted for seasonal flow variability, and that importantly in this inner Niger Delta case study included base flows, base low flows or dry flows, base wet flows, base high flows, as well as the freshet and flood requirements, and then different attributes of that flooding process, with the water rising, the flood onset phase, the flood peak, and the recession phase, and the associated attributes of that system that were important to maintain, that we then incorporated into our assessments. And not only did we consider this for fish, but we considered that and established these models for manatees, for invertebrates, and importantly here considering water disease, and when there were threats of water disease associated with these organisms, for riparian and aquatic vegetation, for migratory and resident birds, and then some integrated larger process models where we look at the relationship between fish and invertebrates, for example, as food for birds, and recession agriculture and the growth of vegetation for livestock agriculture, for example. Back to the fish consideration, just to give an idea of how we progress then from the evidence and our understanding of the biology and ecology of the fish and representing these networks. Well, if you consider going back to that regional scale risk assessment framework, is where we would consider unpacking these models into sources, stresses, receptors, responses, and ranked ecological impacts to the endpoints. Here you would look at, or we would know in the context of maintaining subsistence fisheries and maintaining indicator riverine species and maintaining floodplain species, what were the different types of stresses, how these activities would result in stresses, how you would have flow alterations and what that would be, that you would have reductions in flows, you would have changes in the timing of flows, you would have changes in the duration of different flows, you would have impacts affecting water quality, including nutrients, salts, microbes, and different pathogens or toxicants, and system variables, for example. So we know, and we've got some understanding of these different types of sources contribute to the formation of these different types of stresses. And in the context of looking at human development, we know that there are people as well as alien invasive species that have a similar negative impact on the well-being of environments. And in the context of these endpoints, which are fish-related endpoints, what were these guilds? So we formed these global guilds that to represent what the receptors are and how the receptors would respond to the stresses. And here we identified preferred subsistence species for fisheries of the delta. We looked at all species that grow over a certain size, because after the preferred species are not available, the human communities will then target the larger fish. And once the larger fish are not available, the human communities then target any fish that would be consumed for subsistence fisheries. We also considered and included migratory specialist species, rheophilic species, especially from the river, and floodplain species, especially from the inner Niger Delta. How would they respond in terms of these fisheries guilds? Well, if the volume would decrease, we know that the habitat availability would decrease and the guild would decrease. If the volume would decrease, the connectivity and the potential for connectivity for migrations would decrease, and that would affect the gills. If we had changes in flows, you would have changes in queues, and that would negatively impact the guild. And we can move through all the different drivers and how, for example, even a change in disturbance to wildlife will cause a deterioration of that particular guild and contribute to stress, and how that ultimately will affect in a potential reduction or loss of fisheries associated with social impacts, or you would have losses of the indicator species and loss of the viability of those indicator species for the riverine environment or the inner Niger Delta. And all of that information is integrated into, in the Bayesian network PROBFLO assessment, is we select the indicators, example migrations, and the measure for these assessments, which would in this case study be the depth in meters, and that could be provided or modeled looking at the discharge available for particular scenarios. So with the discharge available from a particular scenario, we would use hydraulics to determine the depth that was available, and that based on the requirements of different indicator species. For example, these migratory species, the cyprinids, for example, which I showed you a picture of earlier, and how those cyprinids would then need a particular depth to migrate and gain access to the delta and then gain access back into the river. We would then prepare these justification tables of evidence for the input nodes, and that then represents the structure of the models and our understanding of how these variables interact with one another. And in order to represent and describe how these variables interact with one another in a Bayesian network context, we needed to prepare what is referred to here as CPTs, or conditional probability tables. And these CPTs were all designed for all the daughter nodes, and that was the rules that represent how the variables interact with one another. And importantly, we were able to address and evaluate the uncertainty associated with knowledge of these endpoints and how they were integrated. This is back to the Bayesian network, the example of the Bayesian network that we developed for fish. And you can see now, instead of just the label, I've opened up the boxes to represent the probable state. And you can see here that we have a whole distribution from 0, low, medium, high. And these 0, low, medium, high ranks refer to the state being in an ideal or natural, that there's no potential for risk to the endpoint, where high would represent that this variable would be in a completely unsustainable state. And where we have these parent nodes include data. You can see I've just indicated with these icons that you have a particular type of water quality information contributing to our understanding of the state of that node, where here you would have a particular geomorphological, hydraulic and water flow related data being able to describe the state of this input sediment supply variable, for example. For mudflats and invertebrates, we would have information from the invertebrate component of the Bayesian network assessment, and that itself would be based on a whole lot of biophysical drivers that influence the suitability of the environment for invertebrates as well as for fish. For migration queues and connectivity depth, we had hydraulic data itself, which provided information on the depth and the habitat characteristics required to maintain those particular characteristics. And then for disturbance to wildlife, we had information on the sizes of communities and the potential influence of those communities and how they would potentially disturb the fisheries, as well as alien invasive species that would respond, that would similarly drive and influence and stress the indigenous communities. And you can see all these green points. You can see this comes from a portion of the Bayesian network, another part of the Bayesian network, but all the yellow variables are products of these parent driver nodes, and as a result there would be a conditional probability table then here representing how whatever the distribution or the state is of the water quality and the state of the mudflat and the availability for food would be, and the suitability of cover from a maintenance fisheries perspective. If you integrated that information using a particular rule table, what would the floodplain habitat look like? What would the potential risk of the floodplain habitat be to the endpoint? And you can see that in this case study, the floodplain habitat looks really good. The floodplain suitability, similar, it looks very good. There are major issues with overfishing and alien vegetation, which influences finally the environmental suitability. And in the context of a very high potential, very high demand for fish, the environmental suitability is somewhat altered, and you can see that results in this risk distribution profile for maintenance fish species in the Inner Niger Delta. And you can see the average here, that out of 100, if you look at the different ranks, we're given a rank of 0, low, medium, and high of 25, 50, 75, and 100. You can see that the average shows that the likelihood, the point of probability is going to be just, the highest likelihood is going to be about there, which is in the medium rank, but that 9.5% chance of high risk is something that has to be considered very seriously, because that is a probability of failure of this endpoint based on the state of this driver. And that's how the Bayesian network works. You can see when we apply it in the context of PROBFLO for the Inner Niger Delta study, we had all of the endpoints listed and the network became a lot more dynamic, but we ensured that it was still robust, and we carried out some sensitivity randomization analyses on the network itself to ensure that the network was a good representation, a good reflection of the evidence that we had available to represent the system. Okay, this is just back to the ranking scheme, just to remind you what the 0, the low, the medium, and the high represent in terms of the ranking scheme that we chose. And what we would do is we would implement and apply the network for all these different endpoints. We'd integrate them, use a randomization tool to provide us this probable distribution of all the integrated social versus ecological endpoints. And you can see that usually when we apply this in the context of these ranking schemes of 0, low, medium, and high, you can see under natural conditions you generally expect to get a 0, low dominated distribution. And in this case, the ecosystem was in a 0, low dominated distribution, which is what you expect for reference conditions. And the social endpoint you can see that the community was in some form of stress, pushing into the moderate, but it's still sustainable and it's still what many would consider to be acceptable. When we determine the environmental flows, what we do is we push the social and ecological endpoints and the probable risk to these endpoints up, and you can see this is as a result of the development of an allocation of resources to communities that you can have a massive growth in the social and economic sector, but it does have its own social implications, and we don't want those implications to be excessive. And very importantly, we want the system, which is here represented in this orange block at the back, to move into an unacceptable condition. And without Eflows, if this is exceeded in an excessive water resource use scenario, you would often find that the probable risk to the ecological part of the system is pushed right up, and that is into an unsustainable, unacceptably high state. And this would represent a system that is in an excessively utilized state, where there would be a very high probability that that system is unsustainable and threatened. The way that the Bayesian network approach determines environmental flows, by the way, is how do we actually determine it? And this is just a very simple representation of, with our networks, if you consider all the networks that are available to us to provide us with a probable risk to these endpoints, we would often set these networks up using present data. And the hydrology that we use, we like to use these flow duration tables that give us a very good representation of all the flow variability available in that system on different months. And this can be based on daily average. This can be based on daily average data or monthly average data. We'd prefer daily average data just because of the higher confidence of the data, but often we find ourselves needing to use daily average data. On occasion, we have to use modeled average monthly data, and but it depends on what is available. So in this case study, for example, we would have one input distribution based on present hydrology to know what the variability of flows would be. So we represent that here with this box and whisker plot to show that the average flows are around this 45 cubic meters per second. That would be the 50th percentile, but the flows do increase during these flood periods up to 100 cubic meters per second and down to almost, I would say that would be about 7 cubic meters per second, but definitely not zero. And based on that distribution, with our understanding of the ecological variable that is querying this hydrology, this may be for a particular month, you can see that you would provide these thresholds for zero, low, medium, and medium high. And once you query that information, that would then be converted into this risk distribution profile based on 0, low, medium, high, and it would then represent what the probable portion of flows are for this particular endpoint in a zero state. And you can see that we just query this box and whisker plot directly for 0, for low, for medium, or for high. And that distribution then would represent this input flow state for a present scenario, because it's something we can measure. We can go into the field and collect data and look at how the system's responding to flows that we are observing under these present scenarios. And that is input into a model and run in a particular direction. This is just to show you that we would use different types of data and evidence to identify these different thresholds that represent this attribute. Then what we would do is we would then, I just want to put all the boxes up. We would then go back and look at natural flows. And this is somewhat of a calibration or validation step in the PROBFLO process using Bayesian networks, because if we would then go back, based on our understanding of how variables are responding to altered flows today, we would go back and look at what the flows were like historically. And historically, if we were provided with a different distribution of flows, a different type of flow profile, this box and whisker plot you can see is shifted. If I just go back one, you can see it's shifted from down to the 20s and 7. It's shifted right up, and you can see now what the base flows are. There's not as much variability. You can see that the low flows now are the middle 30 cubic meters per second compared to what was experienced before. And you can see that this new representation changes that distribution of that node, which in effect with the other components would then, under natural conditions, result in a zero low dominated distribution, which is what you would represent, what you would expect. So when we do these assessments, we use present data to understand the system, and that gives us somewhat of a present ecological state. We go back and validate the data looking at historical natural flows and see whether the model is responding in an expected in a manner to flows that have historically been observed in the study area. And then what we do once we have that information is we push it back. So then we can actually provide a distribution of flows that would represent the balance between the use and protection of the endpoint. And in this case, for example, it could be subsistence fisheries, to use the same ones, that we would provide it with that distribution that we want to obtain. We would block some of the non-flow variables, and we would push that distribution back to show us what is the distribution of flows required in order for us to achieve this particular endpoint. And if we drove it backwards, it would give us a requirement for this particular indicator and the requirements for a particular discharge at a particular month based on a change in percentiles, 50th percentiles. It would allow us to provide data in the format of a flow duration table that we would then give to our hydrologist, and our hydrologist would then produce a new scenario that would represent these requirements that is now as an output of the model. And that's what we would then use. We would integrate that and use that to determine the environmental flow requirements for a particular area. So it's quite an easy process. And these are some of the outputs. So in this case study, for the Inner Niger Delta case study, what we did was we were required to determine the environmental flow requirements for the base study, and what we would need to do that is the reference flows. We would then obtain present flow conditions, and then we would determine the environmental flow requirement. But we, in addition to that, have the opportunity to look at the socio-ecological consequences of different decisions in the context of the model that represents how this socio-ecological system will respond to altered flows. So not only did we then consider the socio-ecological consequences of the reference flows and the environmental flows. By the way, the socio-ecological consequences of the environmental flow assessment should still be acceptable, because that's what we use to determine the environmental flows. But the question then became, what about different historical scenarios that we experienced, and what about a whole range of different other use and or protection scenarios, where we've got different present day scenarios for present developments and future scenarios for future developments. And each of these scenarios can be unpacked into a different demand for water in the water resource. And because of the demand that each of these scenarios have for water, we can determine these flow scenarios, different scenarios that represent each of these scenarios. So what I've highlighted here is the median, or the 50th percentiles, from a flow duration table for all of the 10 flow scenarios that we queried in the study using PROBFLO, looking at the socio-ecological consequences of altered flows based on these 10 scenarios using PROBFLO. And importantly here, you can see just from eyeballing in terms of the 50th percentile base flows, that where the environmental flows were proposed to be, where the reference flows were, and all the different scenarios, you can see many of the future development plans are way above the environmental flows, which is pretty good news in this case study. It's not always the case, but you can see as we go through the flood recession, and very importantly at different times of the month, those different scenarios still are below the environmental flow requirements. You can see, so we're not necessarily going to be looking at the consequences of the flows over here, even though there are storage opportunities to release the flows at different times to meet the environmental flows. But we want to look at the consequences of these different parts, the different timing of these different scenarios. And importantly, we want to look at the consequences of these scenarios where you have reduced flows for future 1, for future 4 and 5, for future 3 and future 2, for example, future 3 and 4 with these worst ones right down at the bottom. So we want to look at those socio-ecological consequences. First step is, in terms of presenting the results to you, is that we present the variability of the different scenarios in the form of these total flow duration curves, or flow duration box and whisker plots. And I just want to show you here that if you combine the total flow available under reference conditions compared to all the other scenarios, you can see how the variability of available flows from integrated, so it's all the months combined, from these extremely low flows for reference flows and what that distribution looks like right down to these future scenarios. And you can see I've just highlighted the reference flow box and whisker plot and the environmental flow assessment box and whisker plot. Those two are important, and those are two that I highlighted before, just to keep us in context with what's important is, does it exceed or not the environmental flows, and where does it plot in relation to reference flows. And you can see, for example, this historical scenario and some of these present day scenarios are very similar to natural flows, that the demand, the use requirements of some of these scenarios is not going to significantly affect the availability of flows in the study area. But nonetheless, we wanted to look at the consequence of these flows, where others were detrimental. You can see even in terms of the availability of flows available over a year, you can see that the amount of water available is negligible. And importantly, we not only wanted to present that from a discharge perspective, but we also had hydraulic data to give us a bit of a low confident estimation of the potential for inundation across the delta. And because it's a factor converting the discharge into that inundation area, you can see that the shape is exactly the same. The equations were just used to convert the areas in kilometers squared on the delta to give us some representation. And what we were able to do was to look back at flow characteristics in 1984 and December 2009 and get some idea of, from historical photographs, satellite photographs, what would it have looked like under different drought, severe drought conditions and extremely wet conditions. And this was available, this real evidence was available to give us some understanding of what it looked like at 4,500 odd kilometers squared and 14,700 kilometers squared, based on satellite images from 1984 and 2009. 1984 is the very dry drought period, and 2009 is that very wet period. Just shows you where they plot on the graph. And then when we represent the results, this is just how we then have included these 50th percentiles, if that's how people feel comfortable to look at the data. But if we then look at the total discharge and inundation area plots, and now very importantly, this is now graphs of the integrated risk of these different scenarios from an ecosystem perspective and from a social perspective. And in an integrated context, you can see that the environmental flows and the present state have all been modeled and packaged to ensure, and you can see here from a social perspective, it's really the social part that's driving the limits of this environmental flow determination, where we don't want it to exceed into the higher rank area. And that you can see has been selected and then used to establish the environmental flow requirement to meet this particular risk profile. But importantly, if you consider the rest, you can see that many of them have plot in the zero, low, moderate range, which is ideal to suggest that it's acceptable. But when you move into these scenarios, number 2, number 3, number 4, and importantly number 5, from an ecosystem perspective rather than a social perspective, you can see that you move into these unacceptably high, and the likelihood of achieving the high and the probability, the portion of there being high risk for some of these endpoints is excessive, and as a result becomes unacceptable. So we have some information already on some of the different scenarios that would be acceptable and result in little change to the delta, and or you could implement environmental flows that would be sufficient to maintain the structure and function of that ecosystem, and or if you started to implement some of these high risk. And interestingly, you can see that although future 5 flows results in relatively high risk, it's the fact that there are so many zero flow probability, there's so many probabilities of no flows during the dry flow period as a result of the ability of all the infrastructures in the study area to withhold those flows, that if no flows were released, you have the potential for these excessively long dry flow periods, which would cause this unacceptably high risk to the study area. And this is all available as an output of the PROBFLO assessment. And then finally, just to recommend some reading, I really recommend that you go back to the Nile Basin Initiative guidance documents on environmental flow series, background document 1, the environmental flow assessments review of global practices and experiences, background document 2, aquatic ecosystems of the Nile Basin, their well-being in response to flow alterations, background document 3, management of environmental flows in the Nile Basin, practices and experiences, and then the Nile Basin Environmental Flow Framework, the technical implementation manual, and there are a range of publications available to you. Importantly, the publication by Horn et al., Water for the Environment, Policy and Science to Implementation and Management. That's a very recent, fantastic review of water resource management, including environmental flow assessments. The PROBFLO publication itself to have a look at, and then with our comments on achieving Sustainable Development Goals, the national targets, I would also recommend that you look at the Stickens et al. Paper, defining and quantifying national targets, indicators, and benchmarks for the management of natural resources to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your time. For more information, please contact Hydrock. Importantly, you can email them at info@hydrock.de. I would also encourage you to visit the website of my university, the University of Mpumalanga, and please do contact the Nile Basin Initiative for any more information. I hope that you've benefited from this module, and please have a look at other modules which will help you with these assessments. Thank you very much. Good day.